Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Stump's response to the problem of evil. What happened last time was just set up. We just set up like the way several of the different conceptual tools she'll be using in her own account. It's an account of freedom of the will defense, and she's kind of situating it in this increasingly sophisticated literature that incorporates freedom of the will as the good that allows God to be justified in permitting evil. So her version is going to be a version of that. So let us continue to look at her actual account. So here's what happened last time. She thinks that evolution is real, like we have strong scientific evidence for it anyway. So it's reasonable to believe in evolution. So we must adjust our beliefs about the fall in subsequent, consequence of the fall. But we can still have it, right? We still have a more evolutionarily accurate description of the fall, and that's still possible. And out of this comment, here are some of the new tools. Out of this, we have a distinction between the human will, what it is to be good and what it is to be distortive. So a good will is a will that is disposed to will what it ought to will. And of course, what the will ought to will is what is good, right? So a good will is one that wills what it ought to, has the disposition, right? It's in kind of inclined and oriented towards that. And the thought is that before the fall, the kind of human psychology was such that we were naturally oriented to do the right thing, the good thing, what was good for us, what was for our community, what was good for everyone. Like, we kind of find delight and we were naturally oriented towards doing that. And one of the consequences of the fall, evolutionarily understood, is that our will has become distorted. So now we have a will that is disposed to will what it ought not to will. So our will, our motivation now is to do the thing that is bad for us. We will what it gives us pleasure and power in preference of what is actually good for us, right? Pleasure and power have this kind of hook on our will and our motivation that blurs our recognition of what is truly good for us. And at the end of the day, that's virtue, right? It's our virtue development character that it ultimately culminates in union with God as heaven. That's what is really good for us. That's our thriving, our doing well, our developing our human capacity in that particular way. And our will now doesn't, like, we're not so motivated to do that. We're disposed to dismiss the value of virtue for the sake of immediate pleasure and power. And those become like the goal of our motivation, the goal of our will in this distorted way. So to have a distorted will is to be disposed to will those things instead of what is truly good for us, namely virtue. And that is a consequence of the fall, claims Stump. So let's spell that out a little bit more. And Stump herself is an Aquinas scholar. Thomas Aquinas is one of the great thinkers in history. And here is the picture of freedom that Stump is relying upon. So an agent has freedom of the will, like the ideal case, when reason, the capacity for the intellect for thinking, guides the agent, guides the person thinking, and importantly, guides the desires of the agent. So a loving husband loving parent chooses to do what is good for the child, and then rejoices in doing so. So it's 3 a.m., the child needs diaper change, the parent wakes up and realizes what is good for the child is for the diaper to be changed. So the reason judges that as the good thing. That's what's good for the child. That is good. That is what makes the parent a good parent. And then so the first step is the judgment, the recognition of what is good for the parent and for the child. The second step is the motivation, the will, the agent, the good parent is motivated to act in the basis of that judgment of what is right. And Aquinas adds, but not just that, it's also the desires as well. So the ideal case, the pre-fall case of freedom is one in which the parent not only recognizes that getting up and changing the diaper at 3 a.m. is the right thing and is motivated to, so they actually get up and do it, but also they desire to do so. They rejoice in doing so. Why? Because it is good. So the desires, the passions, the desire part of the human psychology are in alignment with the judgments. And that's the ideal case of freedom. The judgment, the reason, the will, the motivation what leads to action, and then the more passionate element, the more phenomenologically level desires, they're also there, right? So in the ideal case, the free agent does all of that. And it's all aimed at what's subjectively good. And after the fall, though, all of this breaks, and it breaks in multiple different ways, and that's the disordered will that we talked about. one way in which the psychology of freedom breaks is by desire no longer being subject to will. The parent still perhaps judges that it's good for him to get up and go to bed, but he desires to stay in bed. He's like, I don't want to get up. Let me pretend I'm asleep so my spouse does it, and things like that. The desires are now not in alignment with reason. In fact, sometimes the desires obscure reason, and here we can point to particular desires like anger, right? So sometimes if I'm angry, if we are angry, we post-fall people, our anger distorts our very understanding, right? I may be angry with a child, and it's like, how dare you? I need to sleep because I have to work. And like my anger distorts the fact that it's a child. Like they don't know what they're doing. They just need the diaper to be changed, right? So my anger might make me judge that it's their fault or something, right? So it makes reason make faulty judgments. That's part of the consequences of the distorted will. Our desires, especially things like anger, jealousy, envy, and things like that, distort our very understanding of our surroundings. We no longer see or understand things as they are, at least to a large extent. A different problem with our psychology is that those desires don't just influence the way we understand the world, the reason, but also the way we're motivated to act. So instead of, like in the ideal case, our will is oriented towards what reason says that's the right thing to the extent that it's a good thing. Now the will is oriented towards pleasure and power and other things that are actually not good. So we're naturally oriented towards those bad things. And then the desires mess it up as well. Our anger frustrates our, motivation to act in different ways. So the original inclination for subjective goodness, the orientation of the will itself, the tendency to will what it ought to will, it seems to be replaced by the orientation to will what we are not to will, right? So the reason is messed up by the passions messed up the intellect, the will as well, and the will itself is now oriented towards what is bad, again, what's pleasurable and what's powerful instead of what is truly good. So all is false, and like those of us that are trapped in this predicament, we still sin voluntarily though, because to sin voluntarily is to sin on the basis of our will, what we choose to do, and we still choose to do these things, right? So when the angry parent blames the child for needing a diaper at 3 a.m., the anger distorts the judgment of the parent, and he might choose to stay in bed to let the spouse get up and change the diaper. That's still choosing to stay in bed in this horrible situation in which the intellect's distorted, the passions start taking over, the will is oriented the wrong way, but it's still a choice. It's still flowing from the will. So Stump thinks and Aquinas thinks the agent's still responsible. They're blameworthy. That's part of the problem. That's the predicament, that our will is distorted and we're blameworthy for its actions, but in this kind of weird way in which we don't have a lot of control. A will is distorted as a consequence of that action. So that gives rise to the main question for the article. Okay, if that's our actual predicament after the fall, how can we fix it, right? Like, what's the way out? What's the way of like attaining union with God, with which again means virtue, which means having a good will, willing what is good. If our will is kind of defective, is oriented towards willing what we are not to will, how do we fix it? How do we fix our predicament in the situation after the fall? So how do we make a defective will into a good will that is disposed to do the wrong thing, or what we are not to will, into a will that is disposed to do what we are to will? Well, here are some options. Option one, God miraculously changes the defective will into goodwill, right? He enters our psychology, he restructures it, and now we come out with a will that is disposed to will what we ought to will, with a good will, right? Just kind of miraculously changes us. Some things this can't happen in principle. It is conceptually impossible. God may be able to come in and rearrange our psychology, but that wouldn't give us a good will. That would make us like programmed robots or something like that. God cannot make us freely do anything. So God intervening in our psychology is in effect destroying our freedom, destroying our status as human agents, destroying our moral status as moral agents, and so on. So God couldn't, in principle, do it. It wouldn't be a good will, the result. It wouldn't be a free will. So God cannot do it, not even God. You think, okay, well, God cannot do it. I can do it, right? Like I can choose freely. God might not be able to make me do things freely, but I can do it. So, hey, I'll just choose to do the right thing, right? I would choose to move from a defective will to a good will. And Stump says, well, that's not impossible, conceptually impossible. It's just, in fact, won't happen. Why? Because a defective will, again, is a will that is disposed to will what it ought not to will, right? Is will disposed to will the wrong thing. But hey, one of the things that we ought to will is to have a good will, right? Like it is good to will what is good. So it turns out we're disposed, what it is to have a defective will is to be disposed not to do the things that are, good. So we, in fact, won't do the right thing. So God cannot do it for us. We won't do it for ourselves. That's kind of the horrible predicament we find ourselves. And you might think like, well, that's it. Like there's nothing else, right? There's us, there's God, and like lower animals aren't going to do it. Like nothing else. Like we're stuck forever. Stump says, well, like the whole story of Christianity is actually finding this third alternative. There is a third alternative. That's for each particular person will not to have a good will that won't happen, but to will for God to change the will of the person from a defective will to a good will. So if God just does it, he violates the freedom. If we wait for us to do it, it will never happen because we have defective will. But there's this middle category in which we look up to God and say, okay, God, I give you permission, please change my will. And the thought is, okay, now God can do it, and it wouldn't be against their will. It wouldn't be in violation of our freedom because we're granting permission for God to do it. In some things, that's it. Like that's the solution. That's the way of fixing the defective will. So this is willing for God to save one from one's own sins. And crucially, that's not just from the consequence of one's sins, right? If I do something wrong and I say, hey, God, like make sure that nothing bad happens to me because I did something wrong. That's too simple. Like we do that all the time. The real issue here is to have God save us from our own status as sinful agents, right? It is to will for God to change the kind of being that we are, from going from people that are rejoice in our immediate pleasure, seek power, humiliate others, seek to oppress other people and things like that, to ask God to make us the kind of people that care for others, that will what is good, that will what is good for us and for everyone else, that wills virtue, goodness, community, friendship, love, and so on. And we will for God to help us become that kind of a person. That's what Stump is talking about here. You might still think, well, wait a minute, like, is that possible? Like if we have a defective will, and like wouldn't we be also not like subject to willing for God to help us? Isn't that like one of the things we ought to will? Um, and isn't that like there is no middle path between the two alternatives before? In some sense, actually there is. Like the whole Christian theology, or a lot of Christian theology, is grounded in trying to carve this middle path. And here are some of the main alternatives to make sense of this middle path. One is Calvinism, and Calvinism effectively gives up on freedom of the will. Calvinism says, yeah, there's really no middle ground, but we're stuck willing the sinful thing, and we deserve damnation. It's pretty rough. But hey, God can intervene and make us, like, force us to will God's help, and then that will be against our will. Like that would just violate our freedom of the will. We have no freedom of the will. But hey, God can do it, and then the will be rectified, and things will be fine. Um, the other kind of extreme is the Pelagian view, which says, well, actually, we did preserve enough freedom of the will after the fall that we can still will sometimes to do some good things. Our will is disposed to will the wrong thing, but like, hey, like sometimes we can will the right thing. It's just pretty hard because we're disposed to do the wrong thing. But we can, will the right thing sometimes. So there's legitimate freedom after the fall. And one of the things we can will is for God's help. And now once God helps, and we do it all, right? We just will, hey, God help us. And then God can intervene, and then both of us, God and the individual agent, can work towards becoming better persons. And the account Stump herself prefers this middle between those two. So these two are both versions of the Christian position that in some sense between the two alternatives we looked at before. And Aquinas is a position between these two. And it says, well, humans have preserved some freedom, but not as much freedom as the Pelagian things. We cannot just will to do good things sometimes. We can collaborate with God. So God can give us grace to ask God for help, and then we can choose to accept it or not, right? So it's a choosing to accept the grace that leads us to do good things. And one of the good things can be to ask God to change our will from a defective to a good will. But anyway, these are different ways of trying to carve the logical possibility of this middle road. And then the gradual process of fixing the defective will is what is typically called the process of sanctification. And you can just think of it as the process of becoming more virtuous, right? It's the process of going from willing pleasure, your own pleasure at the expense of what is good for you, and at the expense of what is good for others, power at the expense of goodness, and things like that. And sanctification is the process of moving from willing those things to willing things like goodness, virtue, compassion, benevolence, friendship, and so on, right? Like the good guy. In the end process of sanctification, as we saw in Dante's hell, is heaven, right? The end process of willing the right thing is willing everything that is good to the extent that it is good, and that is a kind of union with God, which is heaven. So the final process of sanctification happens after death, when the will is finally in alignment with what is good, with what God wills, or the other end, and the will is finally in line with what is bad, with hell. So that's the middle position. So with that, Stump thinks, now we have an answer to the problem of evil, which includes natural evil, that is things like hurricanes and bad things that happen that are not directly connected to the consequences of human choice. So she asked the question, what would it take for someone to ask for God's help? I mean, their essential position is to fix our defective will. We must look up to God and say, hey, God, I can't do it on my own. I need your assistance. Please help me, right? Like that's it. Like that's at the heart of her account. And she thinks that's actually very hard to do. It's easy to look at God and say, hey, fix my problems. It's hard to look up to God and say, I am part of the problem. The reason there's so much evil in the world is partly because I'm part of the cause. There is this weakness, sinfulness within me that needs help, and I cannot fix it on. Do it for me, right? It takes humility to do that. It's hard for one to come to that realization, claims Stump. So what would it take for us to ask help? Well, we must recognize that our will tends to do what we shouldn't do. And we must also recognize that it would be better for us if that weren't the case. We must recognize that we tend to choose the cheap, immediate, pleasurable activities that gives us power and control over others and things like that, instead of the long-term good consequences of friendship, community, virtue. And we must realize, one, that we tend to do that, and two, that it would be better if we didn't. So we must find ourselves in that mental space for us to then look up to God and say, oh, help me do this, help me become a good person. And Stump thinks that's why God allows bad thing to happen, to shake us out of our conformity with our vice, out of our conformity with sin. Like if we're suddenly startled with some horrible, bad thing to happen, it makes us realize, oh, the evil's real, like the world is a mess. And then it might make us ask ourselves, why is the world a mess? What's causing this? And then that might lead us to realize, oh, I'm part of the system. I'm part of the problem. I've been, I'm part of the issue here. And that is when the realization of asking for God's assistance might happen. So we need things like the awareness of our own evil, our unhappiness with the situation of our evil, which again includes things like willing what is pleasurable for us and gives us power instead of what is actually good for us and for others. We must find ourselves uncomfortable with that. We must find ourselves wanting to virtue more than power and pleasure. Then we must humbly recognize that we cannot transition from a disordered will to a good will entirely on our own. We need divine assistance. And that's a high bar, right? For us to find ourselves there is a high bar. So here's Stump's kind of final proposal for justifying evil. She thinks that freedom of the will as such is not the good that justifies God. It's union with God. It's the kind of the ideal case of right exercise of freedom in which we will what is good, and we are in this state of union with God. It is the possibility of attaining that state of heaven or full virtue that is the true good. And it is intertwined with freedom, right? It's willing what is good. So here's what she says. God permits evil because it aids, it helps in the process of sanctification, in the process of becoming virtuous, by helping people will for God to fix their defective will. In other words, if there weren't so much evil in the world, we would be very comfortable with our sin. We would be very comfortable with our choosing the bad thing. And then we would end up in hell because we're so comfortable with our sin. We'll end up like Satan, like so self-observant, narcissistic with ourselves. And that's not good for us, right? So what's good for us is to escape that, path towards vice and move towards virtue. And God permits the horrible things that happen around us, because without those, we wouldn't actually ask for God's help and ultimately attain kind of the virtuous state of union with God. Anyway, that's her picture. So let's end here. I'll see you next time. Bye.